What if the most dangerous weapons of the revolution weren't muskets or manifestos, but portraits, wax figures, and brushstrokes? This isn't the American Revolution you learned in school. It's a story of shadowy studios, subversive art, and the quiet chaos of creation. A story where rebellion begins not with a shot, but with a signature. This is Too Complicated for History. Welcome to Too Complicated for History. I am Isaac S. Loftus, joined by the Dr. Lynn Price Robbins, where we come to you twice a month to bring you the history that's fallen through the cracks of your curriculum.
Hey, Isaac. Very, very excited today to have a wonderful author with a very cool new book, Dr. Zara Anishanslin. She is an associate professor of history and art history at the University of Delaware, and her new book is The Painter's Fire, a forgotten history of the artist who championed the American Revolution. Thanks so much for being here with us today.
Thanks for having me. I'm so glad to be here. It's excellent.
So,
Before we dive in,
yes.
Zara, I'm Lynn, sorry to interrupt. This is just for the YouTube audience. And so if this is
Yes.
an audio if you're an audio-only listener, feel free to jump ahead by 30 seconds. But because we're talking about painters, I decided to wear an artistic shirt,
Ah,
which is why I'm
excellent.
wearing what I'm wearing today. However, I would like to have a disclaimer. This is the highest button. Just for... It doesn't... I'm not doing this. There are no more tall buttons above the one that I'm currently buttoning for anyone who may be thinking about commenting about that on the YouTube. Anyway, all right,
Yeah,
continue on.
but aren't you on the West Coast? I feel like that's fine on the West Coast.
It is.
Yeah.
I just don't normally wear it on for our show. It is 90 degrees here in LA right now. So
I just thought you were cool, Isaac,
well, thank you. Thank you. All right, we can get on with the history
cool,
now.
right? Yeah, we're trying to be cool. Um, so talking about your book, because the cool thing about your book is when I think of painters in the American Revolution, I think of like these big names like John Trumbull is always the first one that comes to mind, Charles Wilson Peale. But that's not who you're talking about. You're not talking about these big names that we've heard about and whose paintings we see like in Congress and sort of the famous paintings. So tell us about your book and who you are writing about, since it's not these famous artists we've already heard of.
Yeah, so Charles Wilson Peale, by the way, would absolutely love that you think of him when you think of the revolution, because no one was better at self-promotion than Charles Wilson Peale.
See, it
No.
worked. It still works.
Exactly. So he is in my book. So is John Trumbull, but they are not the main event. And part of that is because the main artists in my book are people who've been essentially left out of the historical and the art historical canon. So, and it's mostly because they are women and men of mixed African descent and, enslaved men. And they lived some or all of the time during the revolution in London. So they are patriot painters that we don't think of because they're not white men who spent most of the revolution in the North American colonies.
Well, we love that. That fits very perfectly into what we like to talk about here on the podcast.
Huh. So I had actually never really... I know that people painted like images of the revolution and stuff like that, but I had never really conceptualized art at the time as being overtly political.
Mm-hmm.
When I think of political art, I think of something more modern, like Ai Weiwei or like, I don't know, Banksy or something like that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well,
Was art back then political in the same way that I'm thinking of it?
100%. So that's the other thing about these artists is that they are creating a radical revolution with their art. So partly because the ones who are operating in London, so Patience Wright, who's an American wax sculptor who relocates to London and opens what becomes a wildly popular wax museum in the center of, aristocratic and political, the heartbeat of London. And she's sort of like, Madame Tussauds wax museum before Madame Tussauds was a thing. And during the war, she uses her wax museum as a place to make politically charged sculptures. So after the Battle of Lexington and Concord, she's outraged when she hears about it. She puts life-size wax sculptures of an Indigenous American man and his Indigenous American wife as a sort of, we are America and we are thinking of America. So in the same way that colonists across the Atlantic are using images of Indigenous people to symbolize America in their prints and paintings that they're creating about the American Revolution, she's doing this with wax. And she's using her wax museum also as a location to gather and then pass along Espionage for her American compatriots fighting on the other side of the Atlantic. And then one of the men with whom she's socially acquainted in London is a man of African descent, although he is, passing as white, but he is definitely of African descent. And Robert H. Pine was his name. And he is creating American art that's so pro-American that he actually he leaves London and lives in Bath during the war. And he complains to friends that he basically loses business because he's used his art to further the American cause. And he's a British guy. He's, born and raised in England, and he's so pro-American that he sort of tanks his career for a time. So yeah, these people are creating, radical pro-American art, and they're doing so very publicly.
So I love the story that you tell in the beginning of your book about, I believe it was a painting by Patience Wright of King Charles the First, and I think it really highlights what you're talking about as far as political art. So can you tell us a little bit about that story?
Yes, this is my favorite painting in the book, and unfortunately, it does not exist. So I have to just describe it. And the reason it doesn't exist likely is a sort of dramatic one. It was probably lost in a shipwreck off the coast of Maine. I could circle back to that in a minute. But the painting itself was of Patience Wright, who, because she ran this popular wax museum, was very famous. So what she looked like was known. Her image was publicized in magazines in London, etc. And so her son, Joseph, was one of the first Americans to train at the Royal Academy of Art. So he's a really good painter. He'd
Mhm.
won an award for sculpture. And if you train at the Royal Academy of Art, it's a really big deal when you get your first piece in the annual exhibition. So Joseph Wright has his first painting on show at the annual exhibition in 1780. And King George III and Queen Charlotte came to that exhibition because they were the patrons of the Royal Academy. And there were enormous bookended portraits of them by Benjamin West, who was friends with the Wrights.
Mhm.
But then there was another portrait of them, and it was one done by Joseph Wright. And it caused quite a scandal. And you can imagine that their majesties were kind of horrified when they saw it, because what Joseph Wright painted was his mother, his famous mother, Patience, modeling the decapitated head of King Charles I, who, of course, had been beheaded by his subjects during the English Civil War in the 17th century. She's modeling the decapitated head of Charles I on her lap, which was the famous way she made her sculptures. She would make them under her skirts, allegedly, and then whip them out. So it was sort of like this symbolic act of giving birth to the wax head. But looking on as she modeled this decapitated head were busts of King George and Queen Charlotte. So, the message is pretty clear here that, Patience Wright is saying, if you're not careful, you might end up like your ancestor, Charles I. So this is in London in 1780. So the war has been going on for 5 years. And what I find fascinating about this, and the reason I opened the book with it, is that you would think this would be horrifying to every British person who sees it, right? But
Mm.
no, the newspapers covered it. And in fact, it was interesting because there are hundreds of paintings in the Royal Academy show, and they only talk about, say 5. And most of them are
Mhm.
by famous artists like Benjamin West. This is Joseph Wright's first. No one knows who he is. This is his first show. And they all single him out. And some of them are like, this is treason. This is horrible that this is hanging on the wall. But other people are like, score one for constitutional liberties and upholding them. And good for Joseph Wright for standing up for our beleaguered brothers and sisters in America by making
Wow.
this point about, constitutional freedoms. So I found that so fascinating, because I think that most of us presume that after 5 years of the war in London, no British paper would be talking about support for the Americans. But in fact,
Right.
there is still support for Americans. And I think that the art is definitely one way that people are showing that support. And, it's not just Joseph Wright, because right after his painting is on exhibition, a London printer makes a political cartoon called The Heads of the State in the Right Situation, pun on right. And it shows his mother, Patience Wright, looking up at a bunch of decapitated heads stuck on above a building in London to make the point that, you know, heads should roll for what's going on with the American war, as they called it in Britain.
Huh.
That just feels so modern day. I mean, a little bit
Yeah,
of a twist, but
Yeah.
still, that feels so
turns out that
modern.
art with shock value predates the 60s.
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. Yes, exactly, exactly.
Even the symbolic giving birth to thing.
Yeah.
I went to school in New York. I used to be a playwright, so I hung out with a lot of avant-garde artists for a time in my life, and they're weird people. It's good to hear that artists have always
Mhm.
been weird.
Yeah, I mean, well, that's the other thing is these people are quirky, right? And so
Yeah.
you get this really idiosyncratic revolution that they are creating and that they are trying to create. Because one of the things that the book does is tell stories about the revolution that never was, both in the sort of metaphorical sense of these are women and Black men and men of mixed race who are essentially left out of the promises of the American Revolution. And historians, lots of historians have talked about this, how the limits of whose liberty and equality get supported after the American Revolution. So, what's left out of the revolution in that sense, but also literal histories that never happen. These people have some wild plots to further the American cause that don't come to fruition. And I think you're right. I think it's partly because they're artists, they're passionate, they're creative.
Mhm.
So they're thinking of idiosyncratic ways to wage war and make protest.
Yeah, you mentioned casually, and we sort of brushed over it. Espionage.
Oh,
Have you heard of
Yeah.
it? Yeah.
yeah. That's how these people are quirky, right? Espionage is like, one of the least interesting things. Um, not really. It's totally fascinating. So Patience Wright operated as an informal spy. So she didn't have a sort of, formal charge from the Continental Congress or something. But she wanted to do her part. She believed very strongly in the power of women to contribute to great causes and great moments in
Hmm.
history. As she put it, writing to John Dickinson, women are always useful in grand events. And she was friends with Benjamin Franklin, although you can tell by their correspondence that sometimes she really annoyed him. But she's friends with Benjamin Franklin, who, of course, is in France most of the revolution. And so she's writing to him constantly in France, passing along intelligence to him and reminding him that, women are important players here. So she's kind of saying what Abigail Adams said to John, her husband, remember the
Mhm.
ladies, but she's saying women can do things here. And one of the ways that she relayed espionage, in addition to in her letters to Franklin in France, was she would slip notes inside wax heads that she crafted of Benjamin Franklin or Lord North or George III that she shipped across to her sister in Philadelphia, who operated a wax museum during the Revolution there. And her sister would take the wax heads, put them on display in the museum, and then send the notes to the members of Continental Congress to whom they were addressed. So, a really interesting way of doing espionage as well. I will say she wasn't perhaps the most effective spy, because in the British Library, there are some wonderful letters that exist in which British officials write that, they're tracking the espionage efforts of Patience Wright, but they let
Oh,
the letters go through because the information wasn't that good, so they wouldn't do much harm. So I don't know how useful she actually was, but
but she tried.
she tried, and she's definitely working as a broker of information. And she mentions casually, for example, things like Lord Dunmore was hanging out at her wax museum chatting with her about the war. So she did have access to these
Wow.
really powerful
Hmm.
men and women in London.
Do any of her wax busts still exist?
Only one full-sized one. So, and that is in Westminster Abbey. And it is
Oh.
of William
Ugh.
Pitt, the Earl of Chatham,
Oh,
because
wow.
he was a great fan of his, because he was one of the British politicians and aristocrats who spoke against the Stamp Act,
Mhm.
and tried to back American colonial rights in Parliament, and was seen by Americans probably as much more pro-American than he actually was.
Mhm.
But when he died, in this dramatic event that John Singleton Copley actually chronicles, he collapses on the House of Lords floor in his robes, and then he dies shortly thereafter. So
Mm,
everyone has seen that Copley painting,
right.
which is famous. But what a lot of people don't also know is that Patience Wright did this life-sized. Already done a bust portrait of him when he was
Mhm.
living, and she curated this life-size wax statue of him dressed in the robes in which he collapsed on the House of Lords
Mhm.
floor, and it stands still in Westminster Abbey. And it's so detailed that you can actually see the little hairs that she and her daughter, who helped her make it, embedded in his wax hands. So it's very lifelike and
Wow.
realistic. And, kind of crazy it's a very different experience to look at the full-sized wax figure of the
Yeah.
Earl of Chatham versus his, sort of classically draped, dramatic portrait that Copley paints of him. So really interesting. That's the only life-size one that still survives. Because as you might imagine, especially once you hear that it's not just wax, it's wax mixed with turpentine to keep it pliable while they mold it. And then the figures are not fully wax. They are usually hands and face are wax. And then the
Mm-hmm.
bodies are wood padded out with cloth and, stuffing.
Right.
And so, wood, cloth, wax, turpentine, flammable.
Not gonna last.
Not going to last. So a lot of her wax sculptures, unfortunately, went up in flames in a
Oh,
fire in a Boston museum in the 19th century where they had been relocated. So it's kind of sad. Most of them are lost to
that's
posterity.
very sad.
But you
Yeah,
can
they're
go
not as
see,
quite as
yeah, you can go see William Pitt in Westminster Abbey, which is cool.
Absolutely.
it's not quite as durable as marble work like Michelangelo.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, no one's crafting marble statues under their skirts and whipping it out either. So yeah,
That we know of.
I mean, listen,
yeah.
Michelangelo could be surprising. You never know.
The untold story, yes.
Just out of curiosity, because this is, I think, might be the first episode we've ever done exclusively focused on art. From the perspective of art history, I'm used to interpreting history and letters and things like that in sort of like written form. How do you suggest that people who are fans of history that necessarily don't look at paintings with this kind of context, don't necessarily think about the intentionality behind them? Like, what's the process for like looking at and analyzing and trying to understand artwork from the past?
It's such a great question because I think sometimes people assume that art is like a photograph, that it just is recording something. But as we know, even a photograph shouldn't be taken at face value because oftentimes photographs are carefully staged and, scenes are manipulated and filters are used and all sorts of things that mean it's not, reality, whatever reality is, which is another show probably. But thinking about, the fact that art, like a portrait of someone, isn't just quote unquote what they looked like.
Right.
It's a very careful representation of between artist and sitter, for example, of what they want to convey about themselves. And in the 18th century, people were used to an iconography that they could read, a visual iconography. So they knew that, different flowers symbolize different things. Different colors of roses even symbolize different things, like a red rose is passion and a yellow rose is friendship. And so, all these things send meanings. And so thinking about art as something where meaning is crafted and created, not just recorded, I think is an important first step. And, thinking too that once you learn to read art or objects, it's just like reading a letter. I mean, you have to read into a letter too. You can't just, you have to read between the lines, so to speak. So in art, you read between the lines too. You just are looking at things visually. But I think it's important to recognize that just like today, I mean, we're all sitting in rooms, in which we chose or someone chose the things around us. They're not just there randomly. The clothes we're wearing, right? As you yourself opened the show with,
Yep.
they hold meaning. And so I think, recognizing that was true for people in the past as well is, one of the first steps to understanding it. And that art is something that oftentimes is a ready conduit for emotion, right? It both expresses emotion and inspires emotional reaction. And I think that's one reason that art can be so important politically speaking. And I think it's one reason that art is used by revolutionaries. And it's also a reason why most tyrants or would-be tyrants start by censoring art. There's a reason for that.
Right.
It's interesting you talk about the sort of an understood iconography. And I'm curious, and this is a little bit outside of the scope of this conversation, so it's a tangent. Feel free to say, I don't want to go down this road. But since we don't have that kind of understanding, I think the general public, I'm thinking of sort of official portraits where there is a lot of intentionality between like the sitter and the painter, like Obama's presidential portrait, with all the greenery around him,
right?
Or King Charles's portrait,
which
that was
not
very
sure what to make of that. The red one,
yeah, the red one. I'm sure there's something there,
Yes.
but I'm not sure anyone understands what's happening in those things. Just curious if you wanted to comment on sort of like that understood iconography or that language that we may or may not have anymore because we don't
Hmm.
interact with paintings and portraiture in the same way as we used to.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that presidential portraits, for example, are great for this. So, you mentioned Obama's portrait, and I think that was a very deliberate choice on his part to, send a message about. I think to me that all the greenery speaks to hope, and that was what he ran his campaign on, and that's, what his presidency was all about. Whereas, Michelle Obama's portrait, I don't think it's accidental that that she's wearing a sleeveless dress after all the pushback she got about her bare arms, right?
Yeah.
So, I think that these are important iconographical statements that are being made, and the concept of a presidential portrait goes back to the first portraits of George Washington, and his portraits were very carefully crafted and staged.
Hmm.
So the famous Lansdowne portrait, as it's called, he wears a black velvet suit, and that is to look both elite and opulent, but not as elite and opulent as a king, right? And I think it's important that he chooses not to be painted in his military uniform, in his Continental Army regimentals, just as he chose not to be inaugurated in them. And that was to send the message that he was a civilian president, not a military president. And those portraits, of course, are copying the example of British monarchs, kings and
Hmm.
queens, whose portraits were hung everywhere in the colonies before the revolution, as well as in Britain. And so, yes, I think there is a clear iconography in those portraits that continues to today, and it's a different lexicon that we have than, different grammar, visual grammar. But I think that, reading the messages in these paintings, it's not hard to do once you start knowing what to look for. Things like in Italian Renaissance paintings and medieval paintings, the Virgin Mary is almost always wearing blue. That's on purpose, right? It's like the,
Hmm.
queen of the heavens kind of imagery. She's never wearing a red robe. And so,
Sure.
without being told that that's the Virgin Mary. So, little things like that that actually hold a lot of important meaning.
And what to me was so impressive is that you were reading into paintings, but a lot of these paintings don't exist anymore. And so, I mean, you had mentioned like the shipwreck.
Yeah.
So you're dealing with paintings that only have contemporary descriptions of them.
Mhm.
So I know it's kind of two-part, but I'm interested in what happened to all of these paintings, and is that why we don't know a lot of these people today, or is it because of who they were, or is that why the paintings are not remembered? And also, um, how you piece together with descriptions, how you were able to, I mean, it's impressive as a historian to read paintings that you can't that don't even exist anymore. So can you tell us how you went about that?
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think it's really important to think about what's not in a museum, just as it's important to think about
Mhm.
what's not in an archive. And so, think about whose letters weren't saved, think about whose paintings
Yeah,
weren't saved, think about, I mean, I think in terms of art history for a long, long time, and arguably still, just as in historical societies' archives, the things that were related to white men and usually elite white men were what were seen as important to save,
right.
right? And so I think part of why these people's art is not saved is because, women and black artists, and I haven't even talked about Prince Dima yet, who's the enslaved portrait painter who trains with Robert Edge Pine in London. And, I think he dies fairly young. He enlists to fight for the Patriots and dies in 1778. So I suspect that a lot of his paintings were just lost to time or misattribution.
Mhm.
And I'm sure some of them are in attics in New England somewhere, or even hanging on walls in New England, and we just
Yeah.
don't know where they are. And then I think in the case of Patience Wright, as I mentioned, a lot of her sculptures are go up in flames.
Mhm.
Weirdly, they go up in flames alongside many of the paintings of Robert Edge Pine. So
Hmm.
these people are intertwined in life. They know each other in London. Their families are connected. When Patience Wright's daughter marries John Hopner, who's a British painter, rumored to be the illegitimate son of George III, one of the two witnesses to their wedding is Robert Edge Pine's niece. So the families are pretty tight. But their paintings and sculptures end up together through an accidental, purchase.
Mhm.
when Robert Edge Pine relocates to Philadelphia after the war to set up the first great American art museum in Philadelphia. Robert Morris builds a bespoke house for him to have a museum gallery in. And Charles Wilson Peele, by the way, not a fan of Robert Edge Pine, because his museum way outstrips the Peele Museum at this point.
Jealous.
Yes, I think so. And when Pine dies, his paintings end up being sold by his widow, his paintings and sculptures, to eventually end up in the hands of a guy called Daniel Bowen, who also buys the contents of Patience Wright's daughter's wax museum in New York. So she has a lot of her mother's stuff there. And
Mhm.
those two museums end up being combined. So the Pine Museum and the Wright Museum end up both being operated by Daniel Bowen, first in Philadelphia and then in Boston, where they go up in flames. So
Oh,
weirdly, these intertwined lives, much of their life's work is lost in a museum fire. So I think part of it is the sort of, inattention to them because of who they are. But, part of it is just the sort of accidental destruction of, time that time wreaks.
right.
And so I think it's really important for us to be attentive to really trying hard to look at histories that are told by things that are not there, just as it's important for us to think about who's left out of traditional archives so often. And oftentimes, it's not accidental that it's women and Black people.
Right.
Out of curiosity, because I do want to talk about Prince Dima a little bit more, but what happens to? I don't think this question applies to him necessarily. Um, the radical artist after the radical period is over. So
Mhm.
these museums are set up. Are they continuing to produce art? Is it like the kind of work? Does it change? How did they view their place or through their production as the war ended and America was established?
Yeah. So Joseph Wright gives us a really good take on this because he also relocates to America after the revolution is over. So this is the shipwreck story. So
Mhm.
he goes from England to France, not surprisingly, kind of rough for him to get commissions after that after that first painting
Yeah.
Yeah.
exhibited at the Royal Academy. He's George III isn't calling him up and asking him to, paint his portrait. So he goes to France because this is, all things American are the rage in France. And he paints lots of portraits of Benjamin Franklin, which is, a whole market in and of itself. And he decides, though, he gets asked by Americans to come over and make a painting and a sculpture of George Washington's head that can be sent to England for a full-size sculpture to be made that they want to, erect of him. So this is kind of a big deal to be asked to do a portrait of Washington. So Joseph Wright packs up all his stuff, sets sail from France, and just off the coast of Maine, before they reach their intended port of Boston, the ship, you know, catches a storm and everything's lost. So the people are fine; they're close enough to shore; they manage to make it, but the cargo's destroyed.
Mm.
So this is where a lot of his paintings ended up being destroyed. But in America, he gets this immediate bump in reputation from doing the portrait of Washington, and Washington is actually very pleased with it. And you have to remember at this point in time, John Singleton Copley has left America with his loyalist wife for Britain. Um, Trumbull is, not yet the Trumbull that we know. And Charles Wilson Peele is, he's okay, but he only trained in London for a short time. This Joseph Wright is a Royal Academy trained. He's kind of a
Right.
big deal. He's a much
Mm.
much more impressive in terms of his pedigree than Charles Wilson Peele is, for
Mhm.
example. And so Washington is kind of excited that he's doing his portrait. And, there's a reason this young guy gets the commission, not Charles Wilson Peele, for example. He ends up setting up shop in New York when it's the temporary capital, and then in Philadelphia when it's, again, the temporary capital. And one of the things he gets is a commission to design the first coins for the US Mint in the 1790s.
Mm.
Oh.
So he designs a Lady Liberty coin, which is a profile of Liberty, and she's holding a Liberty cap on a pole, the famous symbol of freedom around the Atlantic world in multiple revolutions. And so he really channels his protest art into creating a national art for the new United States. So it's sort of, the radical becomes the nationalist in a sense.
Hmm.
So I think that's how he channels it. And Robert Edge Pine, similarly, he establishes what he sees as an American art museum. And he does set out to create exactly the paintings that we have in the Capitol Rotunda today. He creates these large history paintings, most of which he doesn't finish, and some of which are lost to time or the flames. But he also is channeling his radical revolutionary support into national, a national art, a national chronicle of the history of the United States. And this is recognized by the government. When he dies, the Pennsylvania Assembly says we need to make sure that this art does not leave the state, because it is sort of our prototype of a national museum, and it needs to stay here. So, I think these, the revolutionaries become nationalists and nation builders. And I think that's a really interesting part of the story too.
And I think what's even more interesting about that is that your book is a transatlantic history, is we're talking about individuals who were raised or spent a lot of their life in London, who are now coming over and helping to create sort of the culture of the new nation. And if we were just to look at the North American colonies and the revolution from that perspective, we would lose a lot of this history. We wouldn't have all of this. So can you talk a little bit about deciding to go the transatlantic route
Mhm.
versus just the US,
Well, it's partly because I wanted the excuse to go to London and Paris to do research, but
which is fair.
the more serious historical answer is that, again, I think this is something that a lot of people in today's world assume, that we're living in the first global world.
Mhm.
But the 18th century was very global in a lot of ways too. And I don't think you can actually understand the history of the 13 colonies that declared independence together without understanding that they were part of an Atlantic world in which the Atlantic Ocean was a bridge, not a barrier between
Nice.
continents. And so this is true in the revolution as well. The revolution was a civil war in a lot of senses. And it was a
Mhm.
civil war that was not just fought between loyalists and patriots in North America, but a civil war in Britain as well. And, as I mentioned, there's plenty of support for the American cause in Britain, never the majority, and it shifts over time, but there's plenty of support for the Americans. Their cause is seen as just in a lot of ways.
Mhm.
Especially in 1775, there are tons of petitions that are written to the king and the parliament, urging them to, respect American liberties and the British Constitution. So, civil war in multiple senses. And I think that these were people for whom, going Patience Wright or Prince Dima, going from Philadelphia and Boston, respectively, or New York and Boston, respectively, to London, that would be more like them going from, in their mind, Boston to Charleston than, Boston to a foreign country, the way we might think of it today, because
Mhm.
they did see themselves as part of an empire. And so to them, London was in many ways a home, right? It was a sort of metaphorical
Right.
home. And so I really think that you need to understand the revolution from a transatlantic perspective to get at its real richness historically. And I think something I wanted to get across in my book too is that you need to understand patriotism as a transatlantic thing, and that this is a very patriotism was cosmopolitan. It was expansive. It wasn't just people on the North American coast. And I think that understanding that expands our concept of what patriotism means, not just then but also now.
Absolutely. I think one of the things that stuck out to me in your book when you were talking about the well-known artist versus the artist that you're researching and this idea of patriotism, it's glorifying what's going on or what happened versus being more honest about events that happened. So I know there's the one, is it the signing of, is it the declaration where there's the two versions, the glorified and the non? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Oh yeah. So do you mean the Declaration itself of Independence?
Yes.
Yes, yes, yeah. So I think a lot of people would know that Thomas Jefferson's draft got changed considerably before it was finalized. He had a very interesting, very large paragraph about the evils of slavery and the slave trade, and how George III was responsible for the African slave trade, which of course is ludicrous because it's been going for hundreds of years. So not not actually one of George III's false, but that gets cut out of the final declaration, and they make him add in a lot of religious references that he didn't have in his. So, there's this interesting, I think, from a documentary perspective, we have records of how it changed. It speaks to the revolution that never was, I think, in many ways too, that I was talking about earlier, than the limitations of revolutionary ideals. Because, everyone knows Thomas Jefferson enslaved hundreds of people. And, he's writing the Declaration of Independence with an enslaved member of the Hemings family waiting on him, hand and foot as he does so. And when the Declaration of Independence was read out loud, as it was intended to be, if you look at the first copies of it, the object itself, it's not that parchment, cursive writing that we all think of, the sort of, like National Treasure version. It is, it's a broadside, and it's, a big, pamphlet, essentially, but one-page pamphlet, and every grievance is a bullet point. And that's because it's meant to be read out loud. And when it's read out loud in places like Boston, there are people like Prince Dima in the crowd listening. And, he's just recently been enslaved. And so imagine what it's like to stand there in that crowd and hear these words about all men being created equal.
Right.
And then, know that you yourself have been held in bondage. And yet Prince Dima still enlists to fight for the patriot cause. And, most enslaved men in America, more enslaved men in America fought for the British than for Americans because they had a better chance of freedom, at least the promise of freedom. But so I think about someone like Prince Dima and the fact that he is apparently so fired by the ideals that he enlists to fight for this young nation that for most of his life kept him enslaved and treated him as a very much a second class citizen. But my favorite, this sort of links back to the power of image and art. My favorite thing that in response to the Declaration of Independence is George Washington orders it read to his soldiers in New York, where they're stationed. And, soon afterwards, a crowd, partly of soldiers, partly of civilians, we don't know for sure who's in it, fired up by hearing these words about these stirring words of the Declaration of Independence, march down to the edge of Lower Manhattan, and they tear down this 4,000-pound lead statue of George III that's covered with gold. So this huge sparkly statue of George III on a horse. And they tear it down. And among other things, they decapitate it. They cut the head off, and they intend to take the head and put it on a pole outside of a tavern in New York. So very much doing exactly what Joseph Wright does with his painting 4 years later is their intent. But some British officers managed to steal the head away and send it through the wife of one of the British commanders back to England, where it's kept in Lord Townsend's house. And Lady Townsend sometimes will peek, has it hidden behind a sofa, and will show it to people sometimes. So it's very sweet.
It's like scare children.
Exactly. But I think it's such a good reminder, right? That that this is a time of turmoil, and it's a time of contradictory ideals and actions, and people having very different reactions to the same document. I think is something that's so cool to remember.
I do think there's something slightly different in the throes of an emotional moment to decapitate a statue, like in the symbolism, another one to spend a long time in front of a canvas painting said decapitate, like severed head as well.
That's very
yeah, there's like a lot more resolve in, I think, painting the the course of weeks.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's and a much more solitary act too. So plenty of time to think about it. Yeah, no one egging you on. So you had to.
You got to get yourself riled up every time you sit down in the morning to work out.
I really hate that guy. Yeah.
But yeah, I think what you're talking about as far as the limitations of revolutionary ideals is really interesting, in sort of the art breaking down artifice and myth. In one instance, and then like post-revolution, you're literally building myths, like with the apotheosis of Washington and the redundance. Like it is quite literally a myth construction project. It's interesting to see how you could, the same artists are doing both of those things.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you get a good snapshot of that today when you walk into the American wing of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, and the sort of marquee painting is this enormous painting done in the 19th century of Washington crossing the Delaware, right? And
Mm-hmm.
everyone knows this image. Everyone has seen it. It's
Yep.
been reproduced a million times, and historically very inaccurate because, for starters, Washington's like standing up on the bow of the ship, which no, that's not that's not how you cross a river, right? And
That's how you
it's
fall in.
just exactly, it's just very, very glorified. And if you stand in the room and you turn around, you also see a famous painting by John Trumbull of that's called Washington and Lee, and it's Washington in his military uniform, um, very egg-shaped head, though, standing, and next to him, holding a horse, is a black figure identified as William Lee, who was his enslaved valet, who was his by his side throughout the Revolutionary War, the only man Washington freed outright in his will, and he did
Mm-hmm.
so, he said, for his faithful service during the Revolution. And William Lee, we know, was a man of mixed race. And this guy is presented as a very stereotyped, orientalized, frankly, like racially offensive version of a black man,
Mm-hmm.
and does not fit with the descriptions we have of William Lee. But, this is Trumbull wanting to make the point that this, the guy's wearing a turban, which William Lee did not
Yeah,
wear.
yeah. I was gonna say,
Right.
like, just Oriental
Yeah.
as in a
So
very literal sense.
exactly. And so these are the images we have of the revolution, right? Either just mythologized or, not historically accurate in the same sense. Whereas Robert Edge Pine, for example, one of his big history paintings that does survive in copied form is Congress voting independence.
Mm-hmm.
And architectural historians will tell you he painted a faithful rendition of Independence Hall on the inside, which, again, not the more famous Trumbull painting doesn't faithfully recreate the
No.
interior of Independence Hall. And Pine's figures in this painting are much more accurate. They're not as, they're not, they haven't been, filtered in the sense that we talk about today.
Photoshopped, yeah.
They have not been photoshopped. They're sort of paunchy or bald or whatever they need to be. And and then again, to return us to the Met, to the American wing, if you turn around and your back is to the Washington crossing the Delaware painting and you look to the right, you'll see, sort of tucked down on a wall, this little portrait of this, it looks very folksy, not as, sort of practiced as the Trumbull or, other paintings that are in there. But that is of a man wearing a flowered dressing gown or banyan, and it was called in the 18th century. And that is a painting by Prince Dima. And you only know that it's by Prince Dima if you read the label, even though this one is actually signed, but you can't see the back of the painting, of course, that it's by Prince Dima. And Prince Dima, like Trumbull, like Washington, fought for the revolution, right? But then he's not part of this canon that we talk about. But one of the most poignant things about that painting is that the man in the painting, whose name is William Dogood, wears a heart-shaped brooch made of garnets. Again,
Mm-hmm.
this is something that 18th century people would have known. Garnets symbolized love and affection, and it's
Oh.
shaped like a heart. And his family must have loved this portrait because they saved not only the portrait, but the brooch. And it's on display at the Met next to the painting.
Oh, wow.
So it's this sort of story of, even though, this was a formerly enslaved portrait painter who technically wasn't as good as, a Trumbull or a Copley, or a Peel or a Pine, that he still captured something about the 18th century that meant so much to the family that they cherished the painting and the brooch alongside each other. And, so I think expanding our notion of what the revolution looks like can quite literally take us to a new revolution, and one in which the William Lees and the Prince Dimas take the role that they historically played.
Right. And I think we should sort of step back and talk about, so your book, you focus on three artists. You focus on Patience Wright, Robert
Mhm.
H. Pine, we've heard those, and also Prince Dima. So is there a way you could give us sort of an overview of why you chose them and who they were, and something interesting about why they're sort of your artists to focus on?
Yeah, so I actually was inspired by my trip to the Met, to see when I first saw the Dima painting.
Mhm.
And it was partly because I was there with a class of graduate students, a history class from CUNY, where I taught at the time.
Mhm.
And so we'd been talking about art and the revolution and how you can understand the revolution through art. So we were focusing a lot on myth making and that type of thing. And when I was looking at this portrait by Prince Dima, I was just like, wow, this is amazing. And it's amazing. This was in like 2015, just so people know how long these history books can take to
Oh
research
yeah.
and write.
Hmm.
So, just looking at this, and I was like, wow, what an amazing story. And when I started doing a little research on Robert Edge Pine and realized who he was and the fact that Dima had trained with him, I was like, wow, this is amazing, and the amazing transatlantic story. And then I think it's important to remember that women are half of history always,
Yes.
and to bring women into the story because they're always in the story. We just sometimes leave them out. And so I really wanted to make sure that women were central to the story. And by the way, something that I should mention is that Robert Edge Pine's wife was also a portrait painter, but we don't have any of her art that survives.
Mhm.
And we know from descriptions of how he worked that his daughters, at least two of whom were practicing artists themselves, helped him with all his paintings.
Oh.
So he would sort of do the head and they would finish the edges. And so women are always part of these stories. They just get, left out. Like even now, how long did it take me to share that fact, right? So
Yeah.
guilty as charged here too. And so I really wanted to bring a woman in as a central character. And when I figured out that Patience Wright had all these connections to Robert Edge Pine, socially as well as artistically, the only portrait of her that survives is by Robert Edge Pine, interestingly enough.
Mhm.
So, connecting the three of them. And then once I did that, their networks naturally connected. So Prince Dima and Phyllis Wheatley, the famous poet, live on the
Mhm.
same street in Boston after he returns from London. She goes to London, the next year after he's been there. They experience a lot of the same things. As I mentioned, Patience Wright and Benjamin Franklin.
Right.
Robert Edge Pine knows George and Martha Washington. In fact, it's Martha Washington who commissions him to paint some portraits of her grandchildren that hung in the Washington's bedroom and still hang there. And in fact,
Mhm.
Washington's death is one of the classic scenes in American history. And Washington died under the gaze of Robert Edge Pine paintings, right? But this is not something that gets
Mm.
told. And so, really just all of their connections, both organic and more, sort of branching out from their networks, really painted this picture of this vibrant, cosmopolitan, diverse world of patriots circulating around the Atlantic, living in London as well as in America, women as well as men, Black people as well as white,
Right.
and just really reminded me that the American Revolution was a vibrant and diverse world just as ours is today. And I think that sometimes we whitewash that, and literally and figuratively,
Yeah.
and make it, I think, less exciting than it actually was. George Washington's still a big part of this story, but I think we have a more George Washington as he really was, surrounded by people like William Lee instead of just his other white friends, for example.
Right. And it wasn't just all of these people with superhuman talents who were, you know, creating this nation from w- you know, a, a moment of a lightning strike, and then, they they were normal people. I mean, yes, they
Right.
had talents, yes, they were products of their upbringing, but they were normal people just like throughout history and us today. And we can look at back at history and we can look at them and say,
Hmm.
yeah, we're normal people too, but we also can do things. We have powers just like they do. We just have to find them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I take great inspiration in looking at one of the things that looking at this group of three people reminded me too is just that as it's unfolding, the revolution is very uncertain to live through. It's very
Right.
contingent. No one knows what's going to happen. No one's sure what the outcome will be. And I think remembering that is important. And I think that only enhances, again, recognizing that these normal people are making brave decisions, or I mean, as you said, it takes a lot. It's one thing to get caught up in the heat of the moment and sort of as part of an anonymous crowd tear down a statue, although that's an important act too.
Hmm.
But to have this sort of calculated, methodical, I'm going to paint this decapitated head of Charles I and put it where King George III will see it is a different kind of sort of radical bravery, I think. Yeah,
Absolutely.
and I think it should be seen as similar in intent and purpose to the bravery that it took to, march in the army.
Right. It could have been a completely different outcome. And then what would have happened to all of these people? When you look at it as though it's an obvious outcome, they're not really that brave. They're just going with the winning side. But it was absolutely nothing like that.
Exactly. And especially for Americans in Britain, one of the things that Patience Wright does, in addition to espionage and art, is she's very active on behalf of prisoners of war. So hundreds of Americans are imprisoned in Britain under the Treason Act of 1777, which, among other things, suspends habeas corpus and the right to a trial, and refuses to treat Americans who are captured either on the high seas or in battles, and then a lot of people in the Navy, essentially, but also sometimes civilians like Henry Lawrence from South Carolina, who's the former president of the Continental Congress, is traveling to Europe, and his ship gets seized by the British, and he ends up imprisoned in the Tower of London. And so all of these people are imprisoned indefinitely, and they don't know when the war is going to end. And
Right.
I mean, these Henry Lawrence's health is destroyed. The men who are imprisoned are doing things like eating snails that they pick out of walls, and old bones that they find on the ground that they grind up. And when you don't know when the war is going to end, and you've been in prison for 5 years or however long with no trial, no anything. I mean, that's another, and that's also a story that doesn't get told very often about all of these Americans who are imprisoned in Britain during the war and what they suffer for, being American and being pro-American politics. So, it's a very scary time too, because no one is executed for treason, but it would have been entirely possible. And you're not sure what's going to happen if you're sitting in the Tower of London indefinitely.
Right.
Before we get to our last couple of questions, I would like to say that you should definitely, if you're listening, please check out a bunch of the artwork that we've mentioned. We'll try to put links to as many of them as we possibly can, of the ones that do exist.
Yes.
Because there was something about this generation of artists that were doing work in the Americas at the time that they're very good. The painting's very good. That is a small dig at Wollaston.
Well deserved.
Yeah, they weren't always. Not all the art from back then is very good. This is
we'll put a link to Wollaston too, just
I was going to say,
those can compare.
As proof of that, Martha Washington's Children that she had with John Custis by Wollaston is one of the scariest portraits you'll ever see.
They're awful. It's
hanging in Mount Vernon. You can go see it. It's scary.
There's probably some Wollaston descendants out there. No offense.
Yeah, sorry.
But offense, I guess. It was kind of. I don't quite understand what he was doing.
No.
But so we're getting down to the end here, and we had a couple of questions that are sort of general. One, do you have a favorite painting from the era?
I mean, of course, I want to see that Joseph Wright painting of his mother modeling the head, but I can't. So, so I do love. There are two actually, and I can say two because I'll answer one as a historian and one as an art historian. How's that?
No.
Not allowed.
Yes, so as a historian, my favorite painting has to be the painting that Prince Dima probably copied off of a John Singleton Copley of his enslaver Christian Barnes, who is the wife of the merchant Henry Barnes, in whose household he lives. Christian Barnes is really important because she's actually the one who she calls, very offensively, but she calls Prince Dima her Hogarth, her Black Hogarth. And she is the one who comes up with the idea to have him train in London because she asks Copley in Boston if he'll train him, and he says he won't because he won't train a black man. Interesting. He had to go all the way to London to be trained.
Right.
And so one of the ways he continues to train himself when he's not in London is to copy Copley's, which everyone in Massachusetts has a Copley at this point, right? Because he's kind of the only game in town at this point in time. So Prince Dima copies a portrait of his enslaver Christian Barnes, who's also weirdly like his kind of art patron. And it's a cool portrait. It's painted on wood. It's got a really nice quality to it. It's artistically not as good as a Copley, but what's fascinating is it has a gash in her chest. And that is because the Barneses were loyalists. And among other things, they had a horse tarred and feathered as a way to attack them in their name. Christian Barnes was held up at gunpoint in her own house. They suffered honestly harrowing, threats and threats of violence. And they ended up leaving North America and resettling in England, leaving Prince Dima behind, which, is how one of the ways he got his freedom.
Hmm.
However, when they abandoned their house out of terror at the Patriots and what they might do to them, Patriots come and occupy the house, as happened to a lot of Loyalist properties. And someone shoved a bayonet through the heart of Christian Barnes's portrait that
Yeah.
you can still see the slash there today.
Wow.
And then the house was occupied by General Henry Knox and his wife Lucy. So it becomes this sort of, Patriot occupied property. But I love the fact that the portrait, you can still see it today. It exists at the Hingham Historical Society, has
Hmm.
this gash that to me, so it
Hmm.
symbolizes not just this enslaved man with this incredible talent and drive to create art despite his living conditions and his transatlantic cosmopolitanism, but also the divided loyalties in the country that, lead to this portrait being, and the chapter in the book that I talk about it in is called Bayonets Through the Heart, because it's, the sort of metaphor.
Hmm.
And very quickly, I will say artistically, my favorite portrait is Robert Edge Pines of Patience Wrights, because I love thinking about, it's a really lovely portrait. She's sort of diaphanous in its garments. And she's got something on her lap, which, is the right shape to be a wax head. So it sort of
Hmm.
backs up that story. But I love thinking about what these two patriot artists talked about while he painted her portrait. To me, that's fascinating.
Oh,
Hmm.
I like that. So,
That's
I
cool.
mean, we're talking about your book. So, can you tell us about, let's say, when it's going to come out, pre-orders, ordering it? Tell us all about it.
Yeah, this episode should
Yes.
come out with enough time for those listening to pre-order it.
So immediately go online. We'll have a link down
Well, I
in
will
the show
show,
notes.
I had nothing to do with the cover, but I really like it. I will show you. Here's the cover, which
Oh, very cool.
I've been I've been embarrassing my Gen Z children by saying, "Isn't it fire?"
Do the kids still say
So,
that?
yes. But it's kind of not cool to say that, especially when you're my age, which is why it's embarrassing to them. But so it comes out July 1st, Revolutionary Month, and it's available for pre-order everywhere you pre-order your books, Barnes and Noble, Amazon. And yes, I'm very excited because it seems to be being treated by booksellers as both British and American history, which is really what I
Perfect.
love to see. Yes. Although
And
some
it's history
people,
and art history.
yes. And so I was going to say some people call me an art historian, even though I'm not. So that's interesting. So yeah, but yay, interdisciplinarity. Love it. So yes, it's coming out this summer, and I hope that it allows people to reframe ideas about the many diverse people who fought the American Revolution in a
Mhm.
multitude of ways on both sides of the Atlantic, in advance of our big 250th anniversary of
Right.
1776 next year.
Right. And just introduce you to some really neat historical figures that you probably haven't heard of before.
Yes, and some quirky people, interesting lives.
The quirkier, the
And
better.
there's another place for our audience to engage with your work,
Yeah.
and that's with a new podcast that you have coming out. Is it
Yes.
correct?
Yes, we're very excited about it. This is a team effort. I'm the co-host, and it's called Thing for Things, the history podcast where things happen and stuff matters, aka the show about stuff that's not stuffy. So much like yours, it's a history podcast that's conversational and introduces big history and untold histories through sort of bite-sized looks at the objects that people used to make history in the past and connect the past to the present today. And our first season is called The Stuff of Revolution, and it looks at
Ooh,
the American, French, and Haitian revolutions and how people used objects to make protest, wage war, and how that continues to resonate with us today.
nice. And can you hear that? Will it be everywhere where you get your podcasts, or where should people go to listen to it?
Yes.
Okay.
So it should drop June 12th is our
Okay.
launch date. And yes, it should be everywhere you find your podcast. And you can
And we'll
find,
have links in the show notes, of
yes,
course.
thank you. You can find us on Instagram too.
Yeah, so where else can people find you? You just mentioned Instagram. So either you or your podcast, what social media, where can people
Yeah.
find you, learn more about you, maybe ask you a question?
Yes. So all of my social media handles are much easier than my name. So it's fine. So you don't have to know how to type Anishanslin to find me, which is helpful. My website is drzara.org, and I'm on Blue Sky at Dr. Zara. and which makes me sound like I'm about to have a, armchair psychology podcast maybe, but maybe that's not a bad idea. And
No?
on Instagram at Thing for Things, and the podcast is Thing for Things Podcast.
Wonderful.
And I love being in touch with people, so please feel free to reach out, and I would love to talk about history and art.
To be honest, that handle makes it sound a little bit more like you're going to tell people where to buy shirts like the one that I'm currently wearing.
Well, fashion is one of my hobbies. I'm not going to lie. So, happy to dispense fashion advice too.
As always, this conversation was brought to you by our supporters over on Patreon. So if you would like to support the show, please go and check it out at patreon.com/primarysourcemedia. Thank you so much, Dr. Anishanslin.
Thank
Really
you.
enjoyed
It's
this conversation.
so fantastic. I love talking to you.